Today, I am going to explain, in economic and accounting terms, the process by which means of payment are created, a process which has arisen from the exercise of fractional reserve banking. Before we begin, you will need at least some basic accounting knowledge. Keep in mind this rule of thumb. In double-entry accounting, write this down, the left side of an account's entries is called the debit side, and the right side is called the credit side. On the debit side, we record expenses, and on the credit side, we record income. On the left, or debit side, we also record increases in assets, in other words, increases in asset accounts, or decreases in liability accounts. On the right side, the credit side, we do the opposite. We record decreases in assets and increases in liabilities.
Y en la parte de la derecha, que es en el haber, es al revés.
On the asset side of a balance sheet, the left side, we record the value of the goods and rights owned by the company or person in question.
Balances, que está en la izquierda, se recoge
What the company or person possesses, valued according to the rules of accounting.
empresa o de la persona cuya contabilidad estamos haciendo, lo que la empresa tiene.
And on the liability side, we record what the company owes, the value of its obligations to third parties. In double-entry accounting, since the two sides must always tally, they must add up to exactly the same amount, the liability side also includes what is known as owner's equity. Owner's equity consists of the company's capital and reserves. Now we will see how the legal phenomenon we have discussed in recent classes is reflected in accounting entries. As you will recall, with respect to the demand deposit, we said that if I decide my money is more secure in a depository's vault, then I hand the money over to the depository, and it continues to form part of my cash balance. Therefore, in terms of the money supply, I still have 1,000 euros. It does not matter that the money is in the bank if it is on demand deposit. It is as much a part of my cash balance as if I had it in my bag or my wallet or in a sock. It is part of my supply of money. Now, if the depository simultaneously takes 900 monetary units and lends them to a third party, then the third party also has 900. The moment this operation is carried out, the 1,000 monetary units become 1,900. Take note, just like that, as if by magic. Now let us see how this is expressed in terms of accounting. We will begin with the Continental accounting system. I will explain a slight difference in detail between that and the Anglo-Saxon accounting system. The moment a person decides to deposit €1,000,000 in Bank A makes the following entry. In cash, and therefore in assets, it records €1,000,000 on the debit side. And the balancing entry, because in double-entry accounting, and this is why it is called double entry, both sides must always add up to the same amount. The balancing entry reflects the demand deposit, which the bank includes in liabilities, because it acknowledges it as available to Mr. X, the depositor. So far, so good. The problem arises when bankers at Bank A say, well, this money is sitting here idle. It is not serving any function. Why not devote it to our own business dealings? Why not lend it, for example, to Company Z? So they take, let us say, 90%, 900,000 monetary units from their vault, and they lend the money to Company Z. On the right side, you read cash, 900,000. As we said, on the credit side, we record income as well as increases in liabilities or decreases in assets. That is the case. Cash decreases by 900,000 monetary units, which is why the entry appears on the right side. The balancing entry on the left side is where the bank reflects, concerning its assets, that Company Z owes it 900,000 monetary units. Therefore, the second line of entries reads 900,000 loan to Z, cash 900,000. The moment the bankers appropriate the money and lend it to Z, an economic event of vital importance occurs. At that moment, 900,000 monetary units are created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Remember that Mr. X's essential motive for originally making the demand deposit of 1 million monetary units was custody and safekeeping. In other words, he made a true demand deposit, the cause of which is custody and safekeeping. Therefore, Mr. X subjectively, and with good reason, believes he has 1 million monetary units in his cash balances. He does not have the money in his pocket, he has it in the bank, and it is immediately available to him. He can go to the bank today at any time and withdraw his money. Thus, I repeat, Mr. X still has the same balance of 1 million monetary units of liquid assets, or money, that he had before. It is as if the money were physically in his possession, since, according to his contract, a demand deposit, he enjoys the full availability of those monetary units. Hence, there is no doubt that from an economic standpoint, the 1 million monetary units Mr. X deposited in the bank form part of his cash balances and the money supply. Now, take note. When the bank appropriates 90%, 900,000 monetary units, which it had in its vault at the disposal of Mr. X, and it lends the money to a third party, to company Z, Z simultaneously receives 900,000 monetary units, and Z has in its cash balances 900,000 monetary units, which it receives as a loan. So, the bank generates new purchasing power from nothing and transfers it to company Z, which obtains the loan and receives those 900,000 monetary units. So, in the market, as a result of the bank's appropriation of a portion of demand deposits in order to make loans to third parties, the quantity of money in circulation increases. That is, an inflationary effect emerges, because two different economic agents simultaneously consider, and with good reason, that they possess the same money Mr. X believes he has. And in fact he does have 1 million euros in his cash balances in the form of a deposit, and the directors of Company Z, the other economic agent, believe 90% of that money is in their physical possession, because it has been handed over to them as a loan. Notice how the phenomenon of dual availability and an increase in the money supply occurs. Once the bank has completed this operation, it retains in its vault only 100,000 monetary units. This is referred to as the reserve ratio. In this case, we have supposed it to be 10%. The bankers say, with 10% of the money deposited with us, we believe we have enough to handle ordinary withdrawals, those made under normal circumstances. Well, the portion of deposits that are not backed by cash reserves in the bank are called fiduciary media. Notice that the bank has as a deposit 1 million monetary units, and yet its vaults contain only 100,000. This means it has created from nothing 900,000 units of fiduciary media. There is another interesting terminology, that of primary deposits and secondary deposits. The portion of deposits which are backed by cash reserves, cash in the bank, are called primary deposits, and the portion of deposits which are not backed by cash reserves, what we just called fiduciary media, are also called secondary deposits, or derivative deposits. Now, notice, initially when 1 million is deposited and the vault contains 1 million, there are no fiduciary media. The entire deposit is backed by cash. There is no problem. When the bank lends 900,000, then the bank's cash reserves drop to 10%. The bank still has 1 million in deposits, and of the 1 million originally deposited, 100,000 are primary deposits backed by cash in the bank, and 900,000 are secondary deposits, or fiduciary media. And after this whole operation, 1 million monetary units in society have become 1,900,000. 1 million are in the form of real money. And where is it? 100,000 units are in the bank's vault, and 900,000 are in the possession of Company Z, the borrower, which has received the loan. And where are the other 900,000? They are fiduciary media created by the bank. That is, the portion of deposits without backing in the bank's vault. To put it another way, if we considered just this operation, we would say society's money supply consists of 1,900,000 monetary units, and it takes the form of 1 million in cash, of which 100,000 are in the bank's vault and 900,000 are in the possession of the borrower, and another 900,000, which are a mere accounting entry on the bank's books. Since the bank has kept only 100,000, yet it acknowledges 1 million in deposits, it has created 900,000 additional monetary units, which are fiduciary media, a mere accounting entry. We have supposed that because the bank maintains a reserve ratio of 10%, it has created 900,000 units of perfect money substitutes. A money substitute is not actual money, but a fiduciary medium that functions as if it were money. Well, in practice, in modern Western economies, in Europe and in the United States, only around 10% of the entire money supply is in the form of banknotes and coins. So, if we add up the entire money supply of all the countries in the European Union, what does the entire money supply consist of? Well, the combined sum of your cash balances, and yours, and mine, and those of all the companies. Only around 10% is in the form of bank bills and coins. For instance, euro coins, euro cent coins, etc. You might ask, and where is the other 9/10 of the money supply? I have given the answer today. The other 9/10 consist of a sort of virtual money. It exists only in banks' accounting entries. Take note of the example I have offered. We have gone from 1 million units of real money to 1,900,000 units. Only 900,000 have been created. Now, looking to the end result, I am saying that in Europe and in the United States, and in general in Western economies, and in Japan as well, with minor variations, only around 10% of the money supply is in the form of cash, and the rest consists of accounting entries. In other words, the expansion of fiduciary media is much greater than what we have just reflected in these entries. Well, to explain how society arrives at this expansion that is much greater than what we have just reflected in these entries, I will refer to what is known as the bank multiplier. Accounting practices in the English-speaking world are more open regarding this phenomenon of money creation. In fact, they are completely open. Consider how banks in England and the United States have recorded this operation in their books since the beginning. Incidentally, these practices have become widespread and are now used throughout the world. I began by describing the other system because of its simplicity, so to speak. Let us reflect on the same example as before. Mr. X deposits his 1 million monetary units and, as you can see, cash comes into the bank. The bank records 1 million cash, demand deposits 1 million. But do you know what the bank does then? It appropriates 90% and lends it to Z, just like before. But in Anglo-Saxon accounting practices, a prior entry is made. The banker says, I will leave 1 million in cash and the demand deposit of 1 million, but now, as if by magic, I will lend 900,000 to the owner of company Z, open a demand deposit account for him for 900,000 and give him a checkbook. Instead of handing the 900,000 monetary units over to him, I will keep them. But in my assets, I will acknowledge the loan I have created from nothing, and the balancing entry in liabilities will be a checking account, a demand deposit of 900,000 units. I will give the owner of company Z a checkbook so that he can gradually use the loan as he needs it. Now take a look at the bank's balance sheet. It is perfectly straightforward. Deposits, on the right, have gone from 1 million to 1,900,000, and the balancing entries on the left reflect 1 million in cash, actually in the vault, plus 900,000 in loans. Only if the receiver of the loan begins to use the checkbook and writes checks up to the loan amount of 900,000 units to pay his suppliers, etc., will the money gradually come out of the vault. until we arrive at the very same balance sheet as before, when we discussed the Continental accounting system. Once the borrower, who has received 900,000, has written several checks totaling 900,000 and has taken the money out of the bank, only 100,000 is left in cash in the bank's vault, and entries are made for 900,000 in loans and 1 million in demand deposits. But most importantly, as we have seen, the bank recognizes the creation of new money, or perfect money substitutes from nothing, in the form of fiduciary media. For before the owner of Company Z, who receives the loan, even begins to use the loan funds, the total amount of deposits has gone from 1 million to 1,900,000. And this, dear students, is what banks really do. If bankers estimate that with a reserve ratio of 10%, they have enough to handle normal deposit withdrawals, and they have 1 million euros in cash, what do? They leave the money in the vault, but they grant loans for 900,000. They create deposits from nothing for 900,000, and they hand over checkbooks. And therefore, total deposits come to consist of 1 million in primary deposits, which are backed, and 900,000 in secondary deposits or fiduciary media. Thus, as the receiver of the loan writes checks, money gradually comes out of the bank's vault, until only 100,000 units remain, and deposits equal 1 million, only 100,000 units of which are backed, while the other 900,000 units have no backing. And now for the magic trick. What happens when Company Z pays people the 900,000 euros? It may pay a plumber, a labourer, a supplier, etc., who in turn deposit the money in their respective banks. Now I will very clearly and simply explain the phenomenon of the bank multiplier. What are D and D1? They are the original deposits, while X is credit expansion. E is the reserve ratio, which we are supposing in these examples is 10%, and K is the proportion of loan funds which, at any particular time, on average, borrowers leave unused. Company Z may not pay out all of the money. It may use only 80% of 900,000, or it may pay out the whole amount. And yet 20% of the people who receive the money may deposit it back in the same bank, because they are customers of that bank. The credit expansion which follows is indicated by the formula on page 202. As you can see, it is rather complicated, but it yields a result larger than 900,000 units. Based on our example, in which the reserve ratio is 10% and the proportion of unused loan funds is 20%, or Z pays out all the money but 20% of it returns to the bank, because those who receive the money are customers of that same bank. The expansion which follows is not 900,000 additional monetary units, but 1,097,560. But let us consider the case of a sole monopolistic bank, which is very simple, because it is the case in which K is equal to 1. As there is only one bank, and we all use the bank, we will assume we all use the bank, even if I am a supplier of borrower Z and the company pays me, I immediately deposit all that it pays me back in the same bank. And that is important, because when K is equal to 1, this formula is drastically simplified. It is as if there were only one bank in Spain, the Banco Santander Central Hispano Bilbao Vizcaya Argentaria Popular Sabadell, etc. Incidentally, as a digression, the larger K is, the greater the capacity of banks to expand credit and generate fiduciary media, since K stands for the amount of money which returns to the same bank, and 90% of the money which returns can be lent again, and so on. This explains the overwhelming tendency among private banks in a fractional reserve banking system to merge. Do not think this happens on a mere impulse, to make banks larger, or to put them at the top of a ranking. Merging is enormously useful to bankers. The aggregate of the expansion which the Banco Bilbao, the Banco Vizcaya, and the Banco Argentaria could bring about separately is far less than what they can bring about together, since merging greatly increases the chances that when banks expand credit, those who receive the money will also be customers of the same bank. The same is true of the Banco Santander and the Banco Central Hispano. So, the ideal of all private bankers is to be monopolists, because then they have no problem, since they know that whatever they generate from nothing will end up returning to their bank. Let us consider what happens if this situation arises. We will all see very clearly how the process of credit expansion and money creation takes place. Now then, at moment T1, there is no problem. Mr. X walks into Bank A with his €1,000,000 and deposits the money, and Bank A makes the accounting entry we have seen. The bankers put the money into the vault and record 1,000,000 cash. Demand deposits 1,000,000. At moment T2, what does the bank do? We will not elaborate on it any further, since we have been studying it for 3 chapters. The bankers give in to temptation, perhaps legally, because they have already obtained the privilege, and they take 900,000 and loan it out. So 900,000 loans to Z. Cash 900,000. 900,000 comes out of the bank's vault, and Z pays a number of people a total of 900,000 euros. But because Bank A is the only bank, and thus monopolistic, everyone who receives part of the 900,000 euros deposits the money received back in Bank A, and that is what happens at moment T3. The entry made is 900,000 cash. Demand deposits made by A, 900,000. The entry made is 900,000 cash. Demand deposits made by A, 900,000. The bankers say, what are we going to do with 900,000? We will appropriate 90% of 900,000, leave 10%, 90,000, in the vault and loan out the rest, 810,000. There you have the entry 810,000 loans to V, another company, and the 810,000 leave the vault when V makes payments. But since there is only one bank, what is done by all of those who are paid by V part of the 810,000 monetary units? They deposit the money back into Bank A, and that happens at moment T5. 810,000 cash. Demand deposits 810,000. And why should 810,000 sit idle? Ask the bankers. Let us appropriate 90%. 729,000 and lend it. The money comes out of the vault, and when the suppliers of company Y receive the 729,000 units, they deposit it back into the bank, and so on. And do you know what happens as a result of all this? Well, the deposits of the monopolistic bank are equal to the 1,000,000 originally deposited, plus 900,000 in the second round, plus 810,000 in the third, plus 729,000 in the fourth, and so on. This is the sum of the terms of a geometric progression. The terms increase and have a common ratio of exactly 1 minus the reserve ratio. As we can very clearly show, the result is that if the sole monopolistic bank maintains a reserve ratio of 10%, or 0.1, it can increase the money supply tenfold. This is the simplest and most universal formula used to represent the bank multiplier. Deposits divided by the reserve ratio. In our example, 1,000,000 euros or monetary units divided by 0.1, which equals 10 million. And this is the most simplified version of the bank multiplier formula, which Alfred Marshall, an English economist, had already intuited back in 1887. Though there does not have to be only one bank, a sole monopolistic bank, we have taken this approach in order to clearly visualize the mechanism. Now, let us imagine that there are many banks, and that they are all relatively small. As we will see, a very similar process takes place, and the result is the same. Let us consider how this process works. If the banks are very small, the probability that money will return to them is null. In other words, K equals 0. When one of them makes a loan, and the person or company that receives the loan pays suppliers, none of these suppliers will happen to be a customer of that bank, and therefore the money will not be deposited back into the original bank. Does this mean the process of credit expansion is blocked? No. we will see that it is identical. It simply involves various banks. Now, instead of just one bank, Bank A, there will be a Bank A, a Bank B, a Bank C, a Bank D, and so on. And what we will do is add up the balances of all those banks. So, Bank A, ladies and gentlemen, the example we have already looked at. Mr. X arrives with his 1 million monetary units and deposits the money. So far, so good. Bank A makes the entry 1 million cash and then loans out 900,000. It keeps only 100,000. Loans to Z, 900,000, cash, 900,000, demand deposits, 1 million. Well, company Z, which receives the 900,000, pays its suppliers. For simplicity, we will suppose there is only one. In real life, the money is divided up. Different portions go to banks C, D, and E, but I'm simplifying this. There is only one supplier, and she deposits the whole amount in her bank, Bank B. Not Bank A. Do you see Bank B here? It receives a deposit of 900,000. It leaves 10%, 90,000, in the vault and lends the rest. And the person who receives the 810,000 units from V deposits it in his bank, Bank C. Bank C receives 810,000 monetary units, keeps 81,000, which is 10%, and lends 729,000. And the 729,000 ends up in the pocket of another person, Ms. T, who deposits it in her bank, a different bank, Bank D, which receives 729,000, keeps 10% in the vault, 72,900, and lends the rest, 656,100, and so on. Well, we can show that if we add up the deposits in Bank A, 1 million, and the deposits in Bank B, 900,000, and those in C, 810,000, and those in D, 729,000, and so on, we get the same sum of the terms of a geometric progression, with a common ratio of 1 minus C, and that the multiplier is expressed precisely in formula 27. If the reserve ratio is 10%, 0.1, by how much are deposits multiplied from nothing? By 10, 1 divided by 0.1. If a reserve ratio of only 5% is maintained, 0.05, by how much are deposits multiplied? By 20. And if the reserve ratio is 20%, which gives us 1 divided by 0.2, they are multiplied by 5. So, now I ask you the following question. We know that in the Western world, approximately 1/10 of the money supply is in cash, and 9/10 is virtual money, bank accounting entries. So, based on 1/10 and 9/10, we might think the reserve ratio is 10%. Is the reserve ratio 10%? No. In the Eurozone, take note, after the Maastricht Treaty, a reserve ratio of 2%, 0.02 was established. Well, any of you might raise your hand now and complain. Listen, Professor, everything you have said is a lie. Banks' capacity to expand from nothing, perfect money substitutes, or fiduciary media not in the form of cash in the vault, is 1 divided by 0.02. 50 times, and not 10, as you have more or less said happens in reality. How can this be explained? Well, dear students, it is due to a series of additional complexities. But the most important of these appears on page 239. You see, dear students, up to now we have imagined an economy that is 100% banked, in which everyone uses a bank, and in which all of everyone's balances are in the bank. And that is not so in real life. A very substantial section of the economy is made up of people who carry out their transactions in cash. The underground economy accounts for a significant proportion of transactions. I use cash. I don't want to leave a trail. We do not have to go to that extreme, though the underground economy does account for a large part of economic activity. There are many people who, due to custom, tradition, taste, etc., conduct their transactions and pay in cash because they do not wish to use a bank. And this amounts to a sort of filtration out of the system of means of payment which do not ultimately return to the bank. So, even if the reserve ratio is 2%, it is as if it were 10%, practically speaking, because of what filters out of the banking system. and all the formulas are worked out for you on pages 239 to 241.
Hay que hacer de todas maneras una
In any case, we must make an observation in honor of Mises. I am very reluctant to give mechanistic, algebraic explanations like that of the multiplier I have just presented. But the multiplier is so illustrative that it offers students enormous help in understanding the process. In practice, it does not work in such a robotic or mechanical way, though the end result is similar. So, in real life, the multiplier does not function with precision, iteration by iteration, as it does here. This is a formalized caricature, so to speak, of a more complex process. Still, the result is similar. Through the process of fractional reserve banking, credit is greatly expanded or increased against the collateral of unbacked means of payment, which have been created from nothing, and are called fiduciary media, or secondary deposits.
En el contrato de préstamo, cuando de verdad
In the loan contract, when a loan truly exists, someone tightens his belt, makes sacrifices, loses the immediate availability of his money, and hands it over to a third party. This is called saving. Saving consists of not consuming, of postponing consumption to a more distant future, and thus of not spending any of the money handed over. So, I give up the availability of this money now, and I postpone consumption to a more distant future. How? I lend the money to a third party, and I lose its availability. Then, in a year, in a more distant future, the money is returned to me with interest. That is a loan. A loan involves no money creation whatsoever, because the monetary units one party receives have already been completely relinquished by the party doing the saving. Nothing is created. A loan involves no money creation at all. It does involve discipline and prior sacrifice. Meanwhile, in the case of the fractional reserve deposit, take note, loans of very large amounts are being granted, 10 times what is initially deposited, as we have seen, and yet no one has first been obliged to save, to sacrifice his immediate consumption, to discipline his action, and postpone the achievement of his ends to a more distant future. Take note, not only is money in the form of accounting entries created from nothing, as we have seen, but it is also lent without anyone's having had to save it. If bankers spent the money they create from nothing on luxury cars, magnificent buildings, etc., the process would be relatively harmless, because it would affect the prices of only those items bankers bought, buildings, luxury cars, etc. But the process is much more damaging, because what bankers do is lend money to entrepreneurs so that they can launch investment projects as if society had increased its saving, when it has not actually done so. And we will see that this practice triggers continuous, growing, and very long-lasting discoordination between the behavior of entrepreneurs who undertake investments with the new loans the banking system has granted them without the backing of real saving, and the behavior of consumers who have not decided to save anything and therefore continue to consume as much as or more than before. We will see that the resulting discoordination emerges as a speculative bubble, a sort of binge which the market sooner or later reveals to be unsustainable, and which reverses in the form of a financial crisis and an economic recession. Chapters 5 and 6 of the book are devoted to this topic.
la identidad entre la creación de
The
depósitos
parallels between the creation of deposits and the issuance of unbacked banknotes. The traditional banking business went unnoticed by most citizens due to its subtlety. And in fact, economists did not understand it until a century ago, almost yesterday. This business consisted of creating unbacked deposits from nothing, the process we have just explained. And it gave rise to the expansions in ancient Greece, the crisis of Mithridates, that of Callistus in Rome, who was later Pope and a saint, the crises in Florence in the 14th century, the crisis that ruined all the bankers in Seville and the rest of the Mediterranean cities in the 16th century, and so on. Well, in the 17th century, bankers discovered a new kind of business parallel to this one and with identical effects. It consisted of the following. When people deposited money, gold at that time, bankers gave them a deposit certificate, a receipt. I have received from John Doe so many grams of gold. Well, at the beginning of the 17th century, bankers discovered a new kind of business, issuing certificates for more gold than was deposited. The Bank of Stockholm, for instance, began to operate in this way at its inception. This practice is more visible than the other. As the book shows, from an economic standpoint, the issuance of unbacked deposits is in effect identical to the issuance of unbacked bills. The accounting entries are exactly the same. There is only one difference. In the traditional business of issuing deposits, the customer is given a checkbook, and when he makes a payment, he must write down the amount. In the business of issuing paper currency, or unbacked deposit certificates, people pay in a different way. I owe 1,500. Okay, here are 10 100s and 10 50s. I hand over certificates until their amount coincides with what I owe. From a juridical standpoint, before bankers in the business of issuing unbacked deposits of fiduciary media obtained the privilege of legally acting in this way, and I am saying business today with a grain of salt, they were committing the crime of misappropriation. Bankers had to keep the tantundum in cash always available to depositors, and if they appropriated 90% of it to lend to third parties, they were committing a crime. Bankers in the business of issuing unbacked certificates commit different crimes, specifically those of fraud and counterfeiting, because they are saying, I have received from John Doe so much money, when they have not received it. Well, since people became accustomed to paying with certificates rather than gold coins, which they had to carry in a pouch, etc., as long as there was confidence in the bank, the certificates, that is, the paper currency, circulated as if they were gold. Fortunately, on July the 19th, 1844, Peel's Bank Charter Act was enacted in the United Kingdom, where, thanks to the sound theory of what is known as the currency school, the issue of bank certificates or paper bills not backed 100% was prohibited. This was a tremendous success of economic theory, and hats off to the politicians of the period and to the representatives in Parliament who identified the origin of the disruptions which had been recurring since the Napoleonic Wars, and included artificial expansion, financial crises, and economic recessions. They identified the origin correctly and prohibited the issuance of paper currency not backed 100%. However, it was a Pyrrhic victory, because they forgot to also demand 100% backing for the issuance of deposits. Why did they forget? Because at that time, economists were not sure deposits formed part of the money supply exactly as bills do. But be careful. In 1844, they were unsure, but it is important to observe that 300 years earlier, when banks were not in the business of issuing paper currency, Luis de Molina and the Spanish scholastics had already discovered that demand deposits formed part of the money supply. What a shame! If that knowledge the Spanish scholastics possessed had not been forgotten, the Peel Act would also have prohibited a fractional reserve on deposits. And that law, which has provided the foundation for the entire financial system of the Western world, from the time of the Industrial Revolution until the present day, would have prevented all the recurring crises and cycles of boom and recession which have affected Western, poorly named, market economies. We will conclude with another observation. Have we not just explained and illustrated, complete with accounting entries from the book, the fact that the fractional reserve banking system permits the expansion of means of payment like an accordion? Well, take note. Just as easily as the supply of credit expands, it contracts if certain conditions exist. This contraction takes place when 1, several, or a combination of all the following phenomena occurs. A. Instead of increasing, original deposits decrease. In other words, if I go to the bank and instead of depositing 1 million euros, which then increases tenfold with the help of the multiplier, I go and withdraw the money and leave for Haiti, well, then it contracts tenfold. This is the same procedure we discussed earlier, but in reverse. B. The public's desire to hold monetary units outside the banking system increases. Whoa, I do not trust the banking system. I'm feeling uncertain. I am going to keep my money at home. A contraction occurs. C. Bankers are wary, as they are now. After a crisis, they say, I had granted 1 million mortgage loans, thinking the money would be paid back, but I will not be getting it back. And businesses are failing. Well, now I am going to lend money in very small doses and give much closer consideration to borrowers' plans and solvency. So, banks begin to grant fewer loans. They do not lend out 90% of what they receive on deposit. They lend out less. There is a contraction. D. Borrowers seek fewer loans. This is happening now as well. What a blow I have suffered as an entrepreneur. All the hopes I had pinned on my real estate development have come to nothing. I have come close to suspending payments. With great difficulty, I have managed to pay my suppliers and repay what I owed the bank. But I am left with the clothes on my back. To be honest, I am demoralized. I am going to visit the psychiatrist every week, and I am taking all kinds of pills. If anyone suggests getting involved in another business venture, the answer is no. If we enter into a phase in which customers are paying loans off faster than banks are granting new ones, there is a monetary contraction. And finally, E. There are many defaulters, which is also true at present. In other words, many families or households and companies suspend payments and do not repay their loans. This can be so serious, dear students, that banks' assets, which are represented mainly by loans, can come to be worth a fraction of what was thought, while banks' liabilities remain the same. The deposits they have created from nothing. And what happens if assets are reduced to a fraction and liabilities remain the same? Well, from one day to the next, when this is discovered, the whole financial system fails or goes bankrupt. And that is dreadful, because as soon as people realize what is happening, they go en masse to withdraw their money from banks. But it is not there. The monetary system disappears, and we have to go back to practically the cave period to reinitiate from the very beginning the evolutionary process by which money emerges. This paralyzes an entire market economy, and it is tragic. It was precisely to avoid such a situation that the desperate bailout of private banks was provided, a program which began in the United States with several $100 billion with which to buy toxic assets. Toxic assets is a euphemism. It refers to banks' worthless assets, those loans of no value, subprime mortgages, etc. The money could also be used to simply make loans to banks, increase their capital, nationalize them, or directly back or guarantee deposits. Listen, even if you go under, I, the central bank, or Papa State, will cover all of your liabilities. Otherwise, the monetary system will disappear. Today, we have shown, based on Chapter 4, that the fractional reserve banking system is a fundamentally unstable system. It expands with ease and causes bubbles and economic binges. But just as effortlessly, when the market uncovers the errors committed and begins to correct them, the system contracts, and thus has an opposite deflationary rather than inflationary effect. It plunges the entire financial system into a crisis and threatens it with failure. What I am explaining to you here is a reality. In fact, it is just what we experienced in 2008 and part of 2009. This highly unstable and absurd system owes its origin to a historical accident. Minor causes produce major effects, and the Peel Act of 1844 failed to prohibit a fractional reserve on deposits. If a 100% reserve ratio had been required for deposits, as well as for bills, the world would have been very different and far better. Instead of an accordion-type monetary system, which expands and then, with the same ease, contracts in crises and recessions, our monetary system would have been relatively rigid, such as a pure gold standard, with a 100% reserve ratio. Under such a system, expansion could not have exceeded growth in the stock of gold, which has traditionally been around 1 or 2% per year. Such a monetary system would have prevented the regular, systematic granting of loans on a massive scale every 7 to 10 years without the backing of real saving, and thus it would have prevented widespread malinvestment and ultimately severe financial crises and economic recessions. But, dear students, the temptation to fuel inflation is extremely strong. It is stronger than the pull to do drugs. During the euphoric stage, everyone is happy with inflation. Everyone thinks they can find financing for any project, no matter how crazy. People in power boast how well the economy is going, thanks to me. Workers and unions are delighted because during the bubble stage there is full employment. Public revenue rises and rises, and so any expense can be covered. This is an extremely hazardous situation. We should not be surprised to learn that inflation is the most dangerous temptation modern civilization faces, and that the great accomplice in the whole process is the fractional reserve banking system.